By the time I reached the overlook above the subdivision, the water was still quiet. That was what made the whole thing feel unreal. 35 houses sat below me in perfect rows. Fresh roofs. New driveways. Fences, porches, moving trucks, even kids' bikes leaning against garage doors. From a distance, it looked like a finished neighborhood. Safe. Legal. Permanent. The kind of place nobody would ever question once the grass came in and the welcome signs went up. But I knew exactly what sat under every one of those foundations. My land. Not disputed land. Not blurry survey land. Mine. And the part none of them understood yet was even worse. Those homes were not just standing on my property. They were depending on water control that never belonged to the HOA in the first place. I stood there with the deed folder in my hand and watched a woman in a white jacket smile at buyers near the model home like she had already won. She thought I was too late. She thought once enough houses were built, no one would dare challenge the mistake. She was wrong. I wasn't waiting for the bulldozers. I was waiting for the courtroom. My name is Wade Mercer, and the reason I did not drive straight down that hill and start screaming at the first bulldozer I saw was simple. I had already known for weeks. Not every lot number. Not every roof line. But enough. Enough to understand the West Tract line had been crossed. Enough to know the HOA and developer were building with the kind of confidence people only have when they think finished construction will protect them better than a deed ever could. The land had been in my family longer than the subdivision had even existed. Before the entrance signs. Before the paved roads. Before the sales office started calling the place luxury country living, as if printing the word country on a brochure meant they had earned the dirt under it. My grandfather kept every survey, every parcel map, every water record. And every note about that low basin land near the retention structure because he knew what growing developments always do when they run out of easy space. They start looking sideways. The western acreage looked harmless to outsiders. Flat ground. A little slope. Some scrub timber. A water control line most residents probably assumed belonged to the development because it sat close enough to their fences to feel like scenery. But harmless-looking land is the easiest land to steal if the owner is quiet, busy, or dead. That was what they were counting on. I wasn't dead. I wasn't quiet either. I was patient. That difference matters more than people think. The first time I realized something was wrong, the grading crew had already cut the access road too far north. I pulled the county overlay that same afternoon and matched it against the old Mercer survey. The line was not close. It was not debatable. They had stepped onto my tract, and once I saw how clean the error really was, I stopped thinking like an angry landowner and started thinking like a man building a case. So I documented everything. Dates. Drone photos. Survey markers. Tax parcel copies. Construction phases. Every slab poured on my side made the file stronger. That was the part the HOA president never understood. She saw my silence and mistook it for weakness. She thought if I were truly dangerous, I would have started a public fight before the first houses framed out. What she did not understand was that one foundation can be called a mistake. 35 houses cannot. The woman running the HOA called herself Dana Whitmore, and she had the kind of confidence that only works on people who have never read the records for themselves. Everything about her looked polished. White jacket. Perfect smile. Clipboard always tucked under one arm like she was carrying law instead of meeting notes. She moved through the development like the houses already proved whatever she said. That was her real trick. Not evidence. Momentum. If enough roofs were standing, enough buyers were smiling, and enough roads had already been paved, she believed reality would start bending around the project instead of the other way around. I met her once before the first row of houses was finished. I drove down to the sales office after spotting fresh grading stakes pushed past the line my grandfather had shown me years earlier. She came outside before the site manager did, smiling like she expected to calm down some irritated neighbor complaining about dust or traffic. I asked who had authorized work across the Mercer tract. She did not ask what tract I meant. That told me more than anything else could have. Instead, she gave me the same kind of soft language people use when they know the facts are weak but the project is strong. She said the west phase was fully approved. She said all relevant planning had been reviewed. She said if I had questions about boundaries, I could submit them through the proper channels once development mapping was finalized. Once development mapping was finalized. That phrase stayed with me. Because it meant one thing very clearly. They wanted construction to our trun correction. They wanted walls, roads, and families in motion before anyone dragged the actual line out into daylight. Once enough people were emotionally attached to the neighborhood, they believed the land fight would stop feeling like ownership and start feeling like inconvenience. I asked Dana if she had seen the recorded survey. She said the board was comfortable with the site interpretation. Comfortable. Not certain. Not documented. Comfortable. That was when I understood exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. Dana did not believe in title the way landowners do. She believed in finished surfaces. Curbs. Mailboxes. Lawns. She thought a built neighborhood carried more weight than an old legal description because most people panic when they see how much they are up against. I did not panic. I went home, added her words to the file, and let the next row of houses go up. So I let them keep building. That is the part people always react to first. They hear it and think I must have been scared, outmatched, or too slow to stop it. They imagine I stood on that ridge watching crews frame walls on my land because I did not know what else to do. But that was never true. I knew exactly what I was doing. I just understood something Dana did not. A small mistake can be denied. A finished neighborhood cannot. If I had charged down there after the first slab, the developer would have called it a survey disagreement. Dana would have hidden behind phrases like pending review, mapping clarification, and cooperative resolution. They would have slowed one crew, shifted another, bought time, and spent the next year trying to turn my ownership into a technical misunderstanding nobody felt urgent enough to solve. I did not want urgency. I wanted weight. So I built the file while they built the houses. I photographed the first road cut. Then the utility trench. Then the retaining wall near the lower basin. Then the first model home banners. Then the sold signs. Every stage made the problem harder for them to shrink. The more visible the neighborhood became, the more dangerous the truth became. One house over a line sounds fixable. 35 homes with water lines, driveways, fences, and families preparing to move in sounds like liability. Dana never understood that. She saw my silence and mistook it for surrender. Every time I passed through the west edge, she smiled a little easier. She started speaking like completion itself was a legal argument. She would gesture toward the framed roofs and say things like, at some point, reality matters more than paperwork. Once she even told me it was too developed to revisit now. Like concrete and siding had somehow rewritten county records while nobody was looking. That was her weakness. She thought visible progress created title. I knew title survives progress. And the longer the build continued, the more the second half of the problem started mattering. It was not just land. It was water. That western phase sat against drainage and retention assumptions the HOA never truly controlled. The basin, the outflow structure, the release schedule. All of it touched rights tied back through Mercer ground and old maintenance records my grandfather kept locked in steel drawers for exactly the kind of day when somebody would confuse proximity with ownership. By the time the last row of houses started taking shape, Dana looked like a woman who thought she had outrun the deed. I was waiting for the room where paper outranks optimism. The lawsuit began without noise. That was deliberate. People expect land fights to start with shouting, deputies, stop work orders, or some dramatic scene in front of a bulldozer. They imagine a man standing in dust and yelling that the ground is his while crews laugh and keep pouring concrete behind him. That was never going to be my move. I did not need spectacle. I needed sequence. So I filed clean. Deed. Survey. County parcel overlay. Construction footprint. Photos from every stage. The whole case fit into one simple truth: they had built 35 homes on land that still carried my family's name. And they had done it while assuming progress would save them before paper could catch up. The first time Dana saw the filing, she tried to act amused. She walked out of the sales office holding the complaint in one hand like it was an overreaction instead of a blade sliding under everything she had spent months making look permanent. She said I was endangering innocent families over a technical dispute. She said no judge would tear apart a neighborhood that was already standing. She said practical reality mattered more now than old boundaries. Old boundaries. That phrase almost made me smile. Because people only call a boundary old when it stops serving them. I told her if she wanted to talk about danger, she should start with whoever sold houses on land they never owned. That landed harder than I expected. Not enough to break her expression. Just enough to crack it. A blink too slow. A breath she did not control in time. The first real sign that she understood this was no longer a project management problem or an HOA confidence game. It was exposure. And exposure grows fast once lawyers, lenders, title people, and buyers all start reading the same survey line. That was when the phone calls changed. The developer's attorney stopped using soft words like review and cooperation and started asking for emergency meetings. The HOA's council wanted copies of my construction overlays. Title companies started freezing closings in the western phase. Buyers who had been promised certainty suddenly heard the word litigation attached to the ground under their future kitchens. Dana was still trying to sound steady in public, but the tone was different now. Shorter emails. Less certainty. No more fully approved West Phase language. No more smiling references to progress. She had spent months acting like every new roof made her stronger. Now every new roof looked like one more count in a mistake too expensive to hide. After the lawsuit was filed, the whole development started moving like a body that had just realized it was injured but had not yet decided how much pain to admit. From the outside, everything still looked normal. Crews showed up. Trucks rolled through the gate. Model home flags kept snapping in the wind. Fresh sod was still being laid near the entrance of the western phase, as if green grass could calm a legal problem buried under every foundation. If you drove by without context, you would have thought the project was simply pushing toward completion like every other subdivision in that county. But inside, certainty was dying. I could hear it in the calls. The developer's attorney contacted mine first, suddenly interested in practical solutions and temporary accommodation while still trying very hard not to say the one thing they feared most. Trespass. Not accidental encroachment. Not boundary confusion. Trespass on a built scale. Then the title company started slowing down. Then the lenders. Then the buyers. That was when the pressure changed shape. Up to that point, Dana had been treating this like a confidence war. Smile harder. Speak cleaner. Act like finished streets and painted shutters had already outranked the deed. But once closing started hanging on survey language and title exceptions, her performance stopped mattering. The fight moved into paperwork, and paperwork does not care how polished an HOA president looks in a sales trailer. I kept building the file. Drone shots after rain. Drainage patterns near the lower basin. Retention maps. Outflow diagrams. Maintenance logs tied to the old control structure on my side of the line. That second part mattered more every day. Because the homes were not just sitting on my land. They were depending on assumptions about water that had never legally belonged to the HOA or the developer either. The west phase worked because the land beneath it and the water beside it had been treated like solved problems by people who never owned either one. Dana still tried to call it a misunderstanding in public. But misunderstandings do not freeze closings. They do not trigger emergency lender reviews. They do not make buyers show up at your office holding glossy sales packets with fear written all over their faces. By the end of that week, the Western phase was still standing. But it was no longer standing with confidence. It was standing on paper they did not have. I'm keeping this one lock to the exact word count and pushing the story into the moment buyers realize the houses aren't the safe investment they were sold. Thought for 14's the first real panic did not come from Dana. It came from the buyers. Up until then, most of them were still living inside the story the development had sold them. Fresh paint. New streets. Clean title promises. HOA brochures talking about long-term value and carefully planned drainage. Whatever legal noise existed around the edges sounded distant, technical, and temporary. That was how projects like this survive long enough to become disasters. People keep believing the surface because the truth underneath it feels too expensive to imagine. That illusion broke the day a young couple showed up at my office carrying their closing packet. They looked exhausted. Not angry yet. Just scared in that quiet way people get when they realize the paper they trusted may not protect them from the ground under their own feet. The man held a title commitment in one hand and an HOA clarification update in the other. The woman kept looking at the survey map on my desk like she needed it to move before she could breathe normally again. He asked me straight, "Is our house on your land?" I told him yes. Not to be cruel. Because lies were how this mess got built in the first place, and I had no intention of helping anyone keep it standing one more day. I slid the construction overlay toward them and showed where the western phase crossed the Mercer line. Roads. Lots. Foundations. Their street. Their lot. Their house. The woman sat down before I offered her the chair. Then came the second question. Did they know? That one mattered more. Ownership explains the problem. Knowledge explains the betrayal. I told them I could prove the deed, the survey, the build footprint, and the notice trail. What I could not yet prove completely was the exact moment every person involved understood how bad it was and chose to keep moving anyway. But I already knew enough to say this was no innocent slip with one bad flag in the dirt. Too many forms had been signed. Too many roads had been poured. Too many people had nodded and kept walking. The man looked down at the HOA email again. Clarification update. Ongoing review. No cause for alarm. He laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because that was the moment he understood the same thing I had understood weeks earlier. The houses were standing. The truth was just finally catching up. By the time the second wave of buyers started calling, Dana had stopped pretending the lawsuit was just a technical nuisance. Now she was in containment mode. Emergency board emails. Closed-door meetings. Soft language sent through the neighborhood portal about title clarification, survey overlap, and temporary review of Western phase records. She was trying to shrink a structural disaster into a paperwork delay. Because that was the only move left once 35 homes were already standing and the deed was older than every curb in the subdivision. It did not work. People can ignore uncertainty when it sounds far away. They stop ignoring it the second it reaches their mortgage, their driveway, or the bedroom their child is already sleeping in. The Western phase homeowners were no longer asking whether the HOA had good intentions. They were asking who knew the boundary was wrong when they knew it. And why nobody stopped construction before buyers signed for houses sitting on land the county still traced back to Mercer ownership. That was when Dana called me herself. Not through counsel. Not through the board. Directly. She said the situation was becoming disruptive for residents and that I needed to consider the human cost of pressing the case so hard. I let her talk. That was always the easiest way to hear what mattered. She never once mentioned the deed. Never once said the houses should have been built somewhere else. She only talked about consequences now, which told me she had finally understood the point too late. Finished homes did not erase ownership. They multiplied the damage. I asked her one question. When did you first realize the west line might be wrong? She went silent. Not angry silence. Careful silence. The kind people use when the true answer has already become dangerous. Then she said the board had relied on development materials in good faith and that revisiting old assumptions would not help anyone now. Old assumptions. There it was again. The same weak phrase people reach for when the records do not love them back. I told her assumptions were what got 35 roofs poured on somebody else's acreage. Then I hung up before she could ask for mercy in a softer tone. 10 minutes later another homeowner was at my office door, holding closing papers with both hands and looking far more frightened than angry now. The homeowner at my office was named Trevor Hale, and he looked like a man trying very hard not to panic in front of a stranger who might own the ground under his brand new house. He held two things. A thick closing packet in one hand. A printed HOA update in the other. The packet had tabs sticking out of it. The email had Dana's name at the bottom and one of those empty subject lines people use when they need calm words to cover ugly facts. Clarification notice. Ongoing review. Community guidance. The usual language designed to make people feel managed instead of misled. Trevor did not waste time. He asked me straight out whether his house sat on my land. I told him yes. Not because I wanted to hurt him. Because this mess had been built on polite lies for too long already. He looked down at the parcel overlay I slid across the desk and followed the boundary line until it cut through the western phase exactly where his street began. Then he asked the second question. Did they know? That one mattered more than the first. Ownership explains the problem. Knowledge explains the betrayal. I told him I could prove the deed, the survey, the build footprint, and the notice trail. What I could not yet prove completely was the exact day every person involved understood how bad the line really was and decided to keep moving anyway. But I already knew enough to say this was not some harmless error that survived one bad map. Too many chances had existed to stop. Too many forms had been signed. Too many roads had been cut. Too many people had looked at the wrong ground and called it settled. Trevor stared at the HOA email again. Dana's language was all over it. Temporary review. No reason for alarm. Commitment to community stability. He let out one short laugh. Not because anything was funny. Because that was the moment he understood the same thing I had understood weeks earlier. The houses were real. The streets were real. The payments were real. But the certainty they were sold had always been thinner than the concrete. When he finally looked back up, the fear in his face had changed shape. It was no longer fear of me. It was fear of the people who had handed him keys, smiles, and a welcome packet while saying nothing about the one old line in the county record that could make every fresh wall in that phase feel temporary overnight. By the time Trevor left my office, I knew the case had entered its most dangerous stage. Not for me. For them. A land fight between an owner and a developer is one thing. Expensive, ugly, slow, but still containable if the damage stays inside survey maps and attorney letters. Once buyers start carrying closing packets into that fight, everything changes. The mistake stops being theoretical. It gets kitchen counters, mortgage payments, children's bedrooms, and people who thought they were buying certainty instead of standing inside someone else's trespass. That was when the developer's lawyers changed tone. No more soft talk about practical compromise. No more neighborly resolution. Now they wanted emergency meetings, survey comparisons, title review sessions, and immediate access to every document I had already offered weeks earlier. Their confidence was gone. In its place was the legal version of panic, which is still calm on the surface but suddenly very interested in timelines. Dana was still trying to sound composed in public, but her language had changed too. Shorter emails. Fewer promises. No more smiling references to how far the phase had advanced. She had spent months acting like every new roof made her stronger. Now every finished house looked like one more count and a mistake too large to hide behind the word misunderstanding. I kept preparing. I updated the construction timeline. I labeled every drone photo. I matched each lot to the survey overlay and marked exactly where roads, foundations, and utility cuts crossed into the Mercer tract. Then I added the second part most of them still did not fully understand. Water. That western phase was not just standing on my land. It was leaning on drainage assumptions tied to water control the HOA never owned either. Retention, runoff, controlled outflow, all of it depended on records my grandfather kept long before their subdivision brochure ever promised peaceful neighborhood living. That mattered because land was not the only thing they had taken for granted. They built those homes believing the ground belonged to them and the water would keep behaving for them too. By evening, my trial folder sat on the desk in perfect order. Deed. Certified parcel map. Surveyor affidavit. Construction overlay. Drainage records. Control structure ownership. One clean stack. That was the part one found myself thinking about as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the western phase lights came on one porch at a time. 35 finished homes. 35 families. One old line no one respected until the wrong man carried it into the right room. And now the room was coming. Court did not feel dramatic at first. That was the strangest part. After months of noise, rumors, sales pressure, buyer panic, and Dana's polished HOA language stretched over bad facts like a clean tablecloth over a broken leg, the courtroom itself felt plain. Quiet. Fluorescent. Almost dull. No thunder. No shouting. No last-second confession. Just benches, files, and a judge who had probably seen too many expensive people try to argue their way around a simple document. Dana was already there when I walked in. So were the developer's attorneys, the HOA lawyer, and a few Western Phase homeowners who looked like they had not slept much since the title question started. Dana still dressed like confidence belonged to her. Perfect jacket. Straight posture. Folder stacked neatly in front of her. But the energy was gone. She did not look like the woman from the sales office anymore. Back then, finished houses made her bold. In court, the houses were just consequences. When my attorney called me forward, I carried one folder. Not every message. Not every buyer email. Not every photograph. Just the documents that mattered most. The deed. The certified parcel map. The surveyor's affidavit. The construction overlay showing exactly where the western phase sat after completion. The judge looked at the deed first. Then the map. Then the overlay. No rush. No expression. Just the kind of attention that makes polished liars suddenly remember how weak Polish looks next to county records. The developer's attorney tried the same language I had heard for months. Good faith interpretation. Completed construction. Buyer reliance. Hardship. Neighborhood stability. Dana's lawyer leaned into community impact and practical reality, as if new paint and mortgage payments could somehow push a legal boundary a few hundred feet west by sympathy alone. My attorney waited until they were done. Then he placed the survey beside the deed. That was it. The line matched. The tract matched. The legal description matched. And once those three things were sitting side by side under courtroom light, the whole story Dana had been feeding the HOA for months stopped looking complicated and started looking reckless. I glanced at her then. For the first time since this whole mess began, she was not watching the room, not measuring reactions, not trying to steer the mood. She was staring at the deed the way people stare at something they thought they had outrun, only to find it waiting for them in the one place confidence cannot save them. I've got the next section lined up around the courtroom turning point, where the deed stops being just paper and starts breaking their whole story. The judge did not say much at first. That made it worse for them. People imagine courtroom reversals as loud moments. Objections. Gasps. Somebody collapsing under the weight of a lie they can no longer carry. Real damage is usually quieter. A judge reading the deed twice. A finger pausing on a parcel number. A second look at a survey line that keeps landing in the same place no matter how many finished homes are sitting on top of it. That was the kind of silence filling the room now. The developer's attorney tried to shift the ground again. He talked about reliance interests, good faith construction, substantial completion, and hardship for innocent buyers who had already signed loans and moved into homes they believed were secure. Dana's lawyer followed with the same argument in prettier clothing. Community stability. Reasonable interpretation. The idea that no one would ever intend to disturb a built neighborhood if another path could be found. They were not wrong about the hardship. They were wrong about the line. My attorney asked permission to introduce the timeline exhibit and walked the court through it slowly. Original deed. Recorded parcel history. Certified survey. Construction photographs. My first written objection. Continued work. HOA meeting materials. Buyer closings. Then the drainage records and control structure ownership that showed the western phase was not only standing on my land. It was relying on water assumptions tied to property the HOA never controlled either. That was when the judge finally looked up. Not at me. At Dana. And asked the one question that had been chasing her since the first grading stake crossed the Mercer boundary. When did the association first receive information that this land might not belong to it? No one answered quickly. Because the question itself mattered more than whatever careful response came next. It shifted the case away from completed houses and into knowledge. Timing. Responsibility. Who had reason to stop and kept going anyway? Dana's attorney touched her sleeve. The developer's counsel started sorting papers. My attorney said nothing at all. He did not need to. The deed was already doing the talking. In that room, finished walls, fresh driveways, and the smiles from the sales office suddenly looked small. The only thing that felt permanent anymore was the record, and every second Dana stayed silent made the western phase look less like progress and more like proof. Dana did not answer the judge directly. That alone did more damage than any speech my attorney could have made. Because silence means something different when deeds, surveys, warning emails, and construction timelines are already stacked in front of the court. It does not sound like caution. It sounds like memory trying to find the least dangerous version of itself. The judge gave her a moment. Then another. The developer's lawyer tried to step in, but the room had already shifted. Everyone understood the same thing at once. This was no longer just a land case. It was a knowledge case. Who knew enough to stop? Who kept going anyway? Dana finally said the association had relied on development materials and believed the western phase was being built inside the approved footprint. Believed. That weak little word again. The same one she used at the sales office. The same one she hid behind in board emails. Believed when she wanted concrete to sound stronger than title. My attorney asked permission to introduce the county correspondence. The judge nodded. He handed up the email chain, the parcel confirmation, and the surveyor notice showing the western line had been questioned before the last section of homes was completed. Not after. Before. Clear dates. Clean language. Enough to stop any honest project. The judge looked at the date first. Then at Dana. Then back at the warning. The silence changed shape. Before, it had been waiting. Now it was judging. Because once that warning date existed, the whole development stopped looking like a tragic mistake and started looking like a decision that kept moving after somebody had reason to hit the brakes. Dana's lawyer tried to say the association did not control construction sequencing and that the developer bore primary responsibility after notice. The developer's counsel immediately pushed back, saying HOA approval language and Western phase marketing had helped keep buyer confidence alive. That was the moment they turned on each other. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for the court to see what I had known from the beginning. Their unity only lasted while they thought progress could bury the line. The deed ruined that. The warning date ruined it more. Once both were in the record, they could no longer stand together as one confident project. They became what they really were. Separate hands on the same mistake. Once the developer and HOA started pushing blame across the same table, Dana lost the last shield she thought the finished neighborhood gave her. That was the real break. Up to that point, she could still pretend she was part of something bigger than herself. A board president. A community representative. One voice inside a complicated development process where everyone relied on everyone else and nobody could be expected to carry the full weight of 35 homes standing on the wrong land. That illusion only works while the room accepts the idea that all mistakes are shared. The deed and the warning date destroyed that. Because once the court had both, the story stopped being about confusion and turned into something much harder for Dana to survive. Knowledge. Timing. Choice. Someone had reason to stop. Someone kept moving. And the more the attorneys tried to spread responsibility across contractors, developers, approvals, and good faith interpretation, the more obvious it became that Dana had done what she always did. She used confidence to carry a weak claim farther than proof ever could have. In property disputes, finished construction does not erase ownership, legal title and boundary records remain central. The judge called a short recess after the last exhibits went up. That was when the room changed again. Not emotionally. Structurally. The developer stopped looking at Dana like an ally. The HOA lawyer stopped looking at her like a client he could safely shield with tone and paperwork. Even the homeowner sitting in the back row, people who had nothing to do with the original land claim, were no longer watching the case like a technical fight between experts. They were watching a woman who had helped push a neighborhood forward after the line had already started showing through. When court resumed, my attorney did not need drama. He walked back through the chain one last time. Deed. Survey. County correspondence. Continued build-out. HOA marketing language. Water control records tied to the same tract. Then he sat down. The judge looked over the file, over the exhibits, and finally across the room toward Dana and the developer's team. He said completed homes did not erase the landowner's rights. He said hardship for buyers was real, but hardship did not transfer title. He said visible development could not outrank the recorded boundary. That was the sentence that changed the air for good, because all at once the houses stopped looking like protection and started looking like proof of how large the mistake had become. When the hearing ended, nobody walked out like they had won. Not the developer. Not the HOA. And definitely not Dana. That was the strange thing about real collapses. They do not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes they arrive quietly. A lawyer gathering papers more slowly than before. A board president staring at a table instead of at the people around her. Homeowners standing in the hallway with drained faces, finally understanding that the polished little neighborhood they were sold had been built on confidence, not certainty. I stepped outside the courthouse with the same folder I had carried in. The deed was still inside it. The same deed they had treated like an old piece of paper until it stood up in court and turned 35 finished homes into a problem nobody could smile through anymore. That was the part Dana never understood. She thought the houses made her stronger. She thought driveways, porch lights, and moving trucks would scare me into compromise before the truth ever had to stand under fluorescent light and answer to a judge. She thought once enough families were living there, ownership would stop feeling like law and start feeling like cruelty. But ownership does not care how complete the siding looks. It does not care how many lawns were seeded. It does not care how expensive the mistake becomes after people keep building on top of it. By the next week, everything started moving faster than construction ever had. Emergency settlement talks. Title panic. Residents demanding answers. Board members turning on Dana in private first, then in public, the way frightened people always do when they realize they trusted the wrong voice for too long. And the water issue made it worse. because the houses had not only been built on my land. They had been planned around drainage and control assumptions the HOA never owned either. That was the lesson Dana had missed from the beginning. They did not just take the ground for granted. They took the systems tied to it for granted too. As for me, I never needed to raise my voice. I never needed to block the crews with some dramatic speech or stand in front of bulldozers to make a point. I let them build because every poured slab made the truth heavier. Every closing made the record sharper. And when the right room finally opened, I let the deed do what it had been waiting to do all along. They built 35 homes on my land. They thought concrete would protect them. They forgot concrete still has to sit on somebody's name.